The dust had not yet settled on the grave of Andrew Calloway when the silence took her son, and Andrew Calloway spent the better part of 2 years trying every remedy the West had to offer: whiskey for himself, prayers for the boy, before a letter arrived from a schoolteacher in Santa Fe who said she could help. Andrew Calloway was 34 years old in the autumn of 1878, and he had the kind of face that told a story without ever opening his mouth. Deep lines carved at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the New Mexico sun, broad shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of every fence post he had ever hammered and every loss he had ever endured, and hands so roughened by ranch work that they looked almost foreign wrapped around the delicate china teacup his mother had left him, which he never used but could not bring himself to put away. He ran the Calloway Ranch outside the town of Cimarron, New Mexico, 1,200 acres of grassland and creek bed and rocky highland that had been his father's before him and his grandfather's before that. The land was good. The cattle were healthy. The cowhands were loyal men who knew when to speak and when to stay quiet, and most of them had learned very quickly that silence was the preferred currency of the Calloway household, since the mistress of it had died of fever in the winter of 1876. His son's name was Samuel, and he had been 4 years old when Andrew died, and he had not said a word since. Not one word. The town doctor, a rotund and well-meaning man named Dr. Hatch, had examined Samuel's throat and ears and eyes and declared him physically whole in every measurable sense. The boy could hear. Andrew had confirmed it himself in 100 small ways: the way Samuel's head turned when a horse whinnied in the corral, the way he flinched at thunder, the way he smiled, slowly and carefully, when Andrew read to him by lamplight in the evenings. He could hear everything. He simply would not produce a sound in response to any of it. He communicated through gestures, through the pointing of a small and earnest finger, through the widening or narrowing of his dark brown eyes, which were his mother's eyes exactly, and which Andrew found both comforting and devastating in equal measure. A traveling preacher had told Andrew the boy was grief-stricken in his soul. A Jicarilla Apache woman who traded at the general store in Cimarron had told Andrew that sometimes children swallowed their voices like stones, and that the stones had to be coaxed out gently, the way you coaxed water from a reluctant spring. Andrew had appreciated her words more than the preacher's, but neither offered him a practical solution, and Samuel was now 6 years old and had not attended a single day of school because the schoolteacher in Cimarron, a nervous young man named Mr. Pettigrew, had written Andrew a politely worded note explaining that a child who could not speak was, in his professional estimation, beyond the reach of conventional classroom instruction. Andrew had crumpled that note and thrown it into the fireplace and watched it burn with a controlled fury that he was practiced at maintaining. It was his ranch foreman, a wiry and sun-dark man named Pete Vasquez, who had heard about Theodora Wells. Pete had a sister in Santa Fe who sent letters with news in them, real news, not just gossip, and one letter had included mention of a young schoolteacher who had worked with a deaf child and a mute child and a child who had lost his parents in a flood, and who had brought all 3 of them into reading and writing, and what the sister described as genuine understanding of the world. The teacher's name was Theodora Wells, and she had been running a small school out of a church hall in Santa Fe for 3 years, and she was, according to Pete's sister, the most patient and clever woman in the territory of New Mexico. Andrew had written the letter himself, sitting at his heavy oak desk in the study while the ranch house was quiet and Samuel slept. He had not been good at asking for help. The letter had taken him 4 attempts to get right, the first 3 abandoned in the waste bin, the 4th finally honest enough to send. He had explained everything: Andrew's death, Samuel's silence, the failed attempts at solutions, the school situation. He had offered a fair wage, room and board in the ranch house itself, and his word that she would be treated with complete respect. He had not expected a reply. He had sent the letter mostly because Pete had asked him to, and because he had run out of other ideas, and because Samuel had recently taken to sitting on the porch steps in the evenings and staring out at the road as if waiting for someone who was never going to come. The reply arrived in October, 3 weeks after he had posted the letter, and it was written in a hand so clear and deliberate that Andrew found himself reading it twice, not for the information, which was simple enough, but for the quality of the writing itself, which was clean and direct, and entirely without the performative humility he had expected. Miss Theodora Wells wrote that she had read his letter with great care. She wrote that she had experience with children who did not speak, and that she believed, though she would make no promises she could not keep, that patient instruction and consistent presence were often more effective than any diagnosis or remedy. She wrote that she would require 2 weeks to arrange the closure of her current teaching responsibilities, and that she could arrive in Cimarron by the 3rd week of October if that suited him. She wrote that she accepted his offered wage, that she required only a clean room with good light and a writing table, and that she would bring her own books. She signed it simply, Theodora Wells, with no flourish and no apology for its plainness. Andrew had read that letter sitting at his desk while the evening light went amber through the window, and he had felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time, something cautious and almost frightened, like a horse deciding whether or not to trust a new hand. He had folded the letter, placed it in the drawer, and gone out to the porch to tell Samuel that someone was coming. Samuel had looked up at him with those dark, eloquent eyes, and Andrew had crouched down to his son's level and said, "A teacher is coming, Sam. She is going to help you learn to read, and maybe other things too." Samuel had considered this for a long moment, then reached out and put his small hand briefly on Andrew's forearm in the way he had of acknowledging things that seemed important to him. Andrew had pressed his own hand over his son's, and the two of them had sat together in the cooling evening air, watching the last light leave the western sky. Theodora Wells arrived on the stage from Santa Fe on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of October, and the town of Cimarron watched her step down from the coach, the way small towns in the West always watched anything new, which was to say carefully, and without appearing to. She was 26 years old, and she was not what Andrew had expected, though he would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what he had expected. She was medium height, with dark auburn hair pulled up under a practical travel hat, and a face that was neither plain nor conventionally pretty, but that had an expressiveness about it that struck you immediately, as though her thoughts were always very slightly visible. She wore a brown traveling dress with a cream blouse, and she carried 2 bags herself without waiting for assistance, and she looked at Cimarron with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who had moved to a new place before and knew how to take its measure. Andrew had driven the wagon in himself, which was not something he always did when conducting ranch business, but this had seemed to call for it. He had left Pete in charge of the morning's work and come into town, and he was standing beside the wagon when the stage arrived, and when Theodora Wells stepped down and turned and saw him, there was a moment of mutual assessment so brief and complete that it almost felt like a conversation. "Miss Wells," he said, "I am Andrew Calloway." "Mr. Calloway," she said, and her voice was low and steady, a voice accustomed to being heard clearly over the noise of a classroom. She extended her hand, and he shook it, noting that her grip was firm and that she did not look away. "How was the journey?" he asked. "Long," she said, "and interesting. I have never seen so much sky in one direction before." He found that he almost smiled, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. He loaded her bags into the wagon, and she climbed up without ceremony, and they drove out of Cimarron toward the ranch while the afternoon sun made long shadows of the cottonwood trees along the road. She asked questions during that drive, not small talk but real questions. How old was Samuel exactly, and how long precisely had he been silent, and what had he been like before? Was he a talkative child or a quiet one? She asked whether he had any friends his own age, whether he played outdoors or preferred to stay inside, whether he responded to music or to animals or to drawing. She had a small notebook and she made notes in it as Andrew answered, and Andrew answered honestly, which he found came more naturally than he had anticipated. There was something about her directness that made evasion feel unnecessary. He told her that Samuel had been a talking child before Eleanor died, not an unusually vocal one but normal, saying words the way children did, naming things and asking about them. He told her that the silence had come on in the weeks after the funeral, gradually and then completely, like a river going underground. He told her that Samuel liked animals very much, that he spent hours in the barn with the horses, and that the ranch dogs followed him everywhere, and that he had a particular affinity for drawing shapes in the dust with a stick, though whether those were meant to be letters or pictures Andrew could not entirely determine. Theodora wrote all of this down and asked one more question before they turned off the main road onto the ranch lane. "Does he know I am coming, and how did he respond?" "He knows," Andrew said. "He put his hand on my arm. For Samuel, that is a significant response." She looked at him then, a brief, direct look that had something warm in it. "Then he is already more ready than most children I have worked with," she said. The ranch house was a solid, two-story structure built from adobe and timber, larger than most in the area but not grand, the kind of house that had been built for practicality and had accumulated comfort over time rather than starting with it. There was a covered porch across the front and a kitchen garden along the south side that had gone somewhat overgrown since Eleanor, and cottonwood trees along the creek that you could hear from the bedroom windows when the wind was right. Theodora stepped down from the wagon and looked at it for a moment with an expression that Andrew could not entirely read. "It is a good house," she said, which was not quite what he had expected her to say, and which he found he agreed with. Samuel was on the porch steps when they arrived, sitting exactly where Andrew had come to expect to find him in the late afternoon, and he watched Theodora's arrival with his characteristic stillness, his dark eyes tracking her from the wagon to the gate to the path. Theodora did not rush toward him or crouch down to his level, or perform any of the overly warm gestures that adults often deployed at children and which children, particularly quiet ones, tended to find intrusive. She simply walked up to the porch, set down the bag she was carrying, and sat down on the porch step beside him, not too close, leaving a comfortable distance, and looked out at the same view he was looking at. After a long moment she said, quietly, "That is a very fine view. I can see why you like sitting here." Samuel turned to look at her. He looked at her for a long time with his dark, measuring eyes. Then he turned back to the view and nodded once. Andrew, watching from the gate, felt something shift in his chest again, that same cautious, almost frightened movement. He picked up Theodora's bags and carried them inside. The first week was one of watching and learning on Theodora's part, and Andrew found himself watching her as much as she watched Samuel. She did not begin with formal lessons. She simply inserted herself into the rhythm of the boy's days with a quiet patience that Andrew found remarkable. She sat with Samuel in the barn while he spent time with the horses, and she did not try to make him speak or respond. She simply narrated what she noticed. "That roan mare has an interesting way of holding her ear. She is listening to something," in the tone of someone sharing an observation rather than conducting an examination. She drew pictures in a notebook and left the notebook where Samuel could reach it. By the third day, he was reaching for it. She asked Andrew for supplies: paper, chalk, a small blackboard if it could be obtained, paints if possible. He drove back into Cimarron and bought everything she listed. The general store owner, a Mrs. Abernathy, asked if the new teacher was settling in all right, and Andrew said yes, and Mrs. Abernathy gave him a look that said she was storing this information for later use, which was the nature of small-town commerce. By the end of the first week, Samuel was sitting with Theodora for what Andrew could only describe as lessons, though they looked nothing like any school he had attended. They sat at the kitchen table with paper and chalk between them, and Theodora would draw a letter and make it sound, and then draw a picture of something that began with that sound. And Samuel would look and then, with great deliberateness, copy the letter himself. He was 6 years old, and he took the work seriously in the way that children sometimes do when they sense that something real is at stake. Andrew watched these sessions sometimes from the doorway, and once Theodora looked up and caught him there, and she gave him a small nod that seemed to say the boy was doing well, and Andrew felt something warm move through him that he did not examine too closely. In the evenings, after Samuel had been put to bed, Andrew and Theodora sometimes sat in the main room, where there was a fireplace and 2 good chairs and a reading lamp, and they talked. These conversations began practical, how Samuel was responding, what Theodora planned to try next, what she had observed, but they expanded, the way conversations between 2 honest people tend to do when the environment is quiet and the firelight is steady. She told him about Santa Fe, about the church hall school where she had worked, about the 3 children who had become her particular successes, the deaf girl who had learned to read lips and write long, beautiful sentences, the mute boy who had learned to communicate through drawing, the flood-orphaned child who had needed above all else to feel that the world contained reliable things. He told her things he had not told anyone. He told her about Alina, how she had been the kind of woman who made a house feel inhabited even when she was in another room, and how the house had felt like a shell after she was gone, and how he had spent the first year simply trying to maintain the physical routine of the ranch, because if he stopped moving, he thought he might not start again. He told her that the hardest moment every day was reading to Samuel at night, because those were the stories Alina had chosen, and the books still smelled of her somehow, or maybe he only imagined they did. Theodora listened to all of this with her full attention, which was the kind of listening that is rarer than it sounds, and she did not offer comfort in the usual hollow shapes, but simply acknowledged what he said, and sometimes asked a question that showed she had heard the exact thing he meant, not just the words around it. One night, in the 2nd week of her stay, she told him about her own mother, who had died when Theodora was 16, and how she had spent the years after teaching herself everything her mother had meant to teach her, not from books, but from the process of figuring out how to be a person without a guide. She said she thought perhaps this was why she was drawn to children who had lost something, because she understood that the loss was not just of a person, but of a whole way of understanding the world, and that what such children needed was someone to help them build a new way. Andrew looked at her in the firelight after she said this, and she was looking at the fire and not at him, and he was aware, with a sudden and disconcerting clarity, that she was one of the most interesting people he had ever sat in a room with. He said nothing about that. He said, "You are very good at this, Miss Wells." She glanced at him then, and something in her face moved. "I think Samuel is going to be more than all right," she said. "I want you to know that. He is in there completely. He simply needs a bridge." He nodded and looked at the fire himself, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, which he noted because it had been a long time since he had sat in silence with another person and felt it as comfort rather than weight. October turned to November and the nights grew cold, and Theodora wrote to Mrs. Abernathy at the general store to order 2 additional blankets, which she paid for herself, and Andrew added them to his account without mentioning it to her because he was aware she might argue. The ranch hands had taken to her in the gradual, reserved way that men who worked with horses took to anyone slowly, and on the basis of demonstrated reliability rather than charm. Pete Vasquez had told Andrew, in the oblique way he had of delivering opinions, that the new teacher seemed like a woman who knew how to be in the world, which from Pete was approximately the highest compliment available. Samuel was making real progress. He had learned the full alphabet from Theodora's picture letter system, and was beginning to connect letters into simple words. More importantly, he was communicating more, not in words, but in an expanding vocabulary of gestures and drawings, and pointed fingers and expressions that Theodora had helped him develop into something approaching a functional language. He and Theodora had their own system of signals, worked out over weeks of patient practice, and watching them use it was like watching two people who had developed a private dialect. But Samuel had not spoken. Not a word, not a sound. And Andrew, who was trying very hard not to put expectations on any of this, could not quite suppress the deep, quiet hope that lived in his chest, alongside the fear that the hope was foolish. In the third week of November, something happened that changed the shape of everything. It began simply enough. Andrew had ridden out early to check on the northern fence line, which Pete had reported was in need of repair after a hard wind the previous week. He was gone most of the morning, and he returned around midday to find the ranch house quiet, which was not unusual, except that it was the wrong kind of quiet. He put his horse in the corral and walked up to the house and heard, before he reached the porch, the sound of Theodora's voice, not calm and measured as it usually was but slightly unsteady, speaking to someone he could not see. He went inside and found Theodora in the kitchen with Samuel, who was sitting on the floor against the wall with his knees drawn up, and his face had a look that Andrew had learned to recognize over 2 years as Samuel's particular expression of profound distress, the one that meant something had broken through whatever dam the boy maintained around himself. Theodora was crouched near him, not touching him, speaking softly. Andrew came in and Theodora looked up at him and she said quietly, "He found a bird in the yard. It was injured. He brought it to me and we tried to help it, but it did not survive." Andrew looked at his son on the floor. Samuel was staring at his own hands. Andrew crossed the kitchen and sat down on the floor beside Samuel, not against the wall the way Samuel was, but turned slightly toward him, close enough to be present. He said, "Sam." Samuel looked up. "I am sorry about the bird," Andrew said. "It happens sometimes, and it is the hardest thing." Samuel's chin trembled. He looked at his father with his mother's eyes, and Andrew could see exactly what was in them. Grief for the bird, yes, but older grief underneath it. Grief that had been sitting in the boy like a stopped clock for 2 years. Theodora, still crouching nearby, spoke very softly. "Samuel," she said, "would you like to bury the bird? We could give it a proper place." Something changed in Samuel's face. He looked at Theodora for a long moment. And then, in a voice so rusty and small from disuse that Andrew felt it like a physical thing in his own throat, Samuel said one word. He said, "Theo." The sound of it fell into the kitchen like a stone into still water, and the ripples went in all directions at once. Theodora's hand went very briefly to her own mouth. Andrew felt his breath stop. Samuel said it again, slightly more clearly. "Theo." Theodora's voice was entirely steady when she answered, which Andrew suspected cost her something. "Yes," she said. "I am here. Shall we go bury the bird?" Samuel uncurled from the wall and stood up, and he took Theodora's hand, which was not unusual, but he kept looking at her as he did it, as if confirming something. Andrew stood up too, and his legs were not quite steady, and he turned toward the window so that neither of them could see his face for a moment. Through the window, the November light was thin and pale over the hills, and the cottonwood trees along the creek had lost almost all their leaves, and everything was very clear and very cold, and he was aware that he was crying, quietly and without dramatic effort, simply because 2 years of hope had just been answered by a 6-year-old boy saying one syllable, and that syllable had been her name. He collected himself before he turned around. He went with them to bury the bird in the kitchen garden, and Samuel chose the spot with great deliberateness, near the rosemary that Alina had planted, which was the only thing in the garden that had survived 2 years of neglect, and Theodora dug the small hole with a trowel, and Samuel placed the bird in it wrapped in a piece of cloth from the rag bin, and Andrew helped fill the hole back in, and the 3 of them stood over it for a moment in the November cold. That evening at dinner, Samuel spoke 3 more times. He asked in his small and rusty voice to pass the bread, not with those words exactly, but with the word bread combined with a pointing gesture that communicated the full request. he said, warm, when Andrew brought the lamp closer. And before Andrew put him to bed, Samuel looked at Theodora, who was gathering the dinner dishes, and said, very quietly, "Thank you, Theo." Theodora had her back to the room. She did not turn around immediately. When she did, her face was composed and kind and gave almost nothing away except to someone who was paying close attention. And Andrew was paying close attention, and he saw the brightness in her eyes that she was controlling. Andrew read Samuel's story that night, the usual evening ritual, and halfway through Samuel fell asleep, as he always did. And Andrew sat for a moment in the chair beside the bed in the lamplight with the book open in his lap, listening to his son breathe, which was something he had done many times over the past 2 years, and which tonight felt entirely different because the boy had spoken today, and the first word he had chosen had been a name, and the name had been hers. Andrew went downstairs and found Theodora in the main room with a book, and she looked up when he came in, and he stood in the doorway for a moment because he had something to say and was not certain how to say it without it sounding like more than he intended, or perhaps exactly as much as he intended, and that was the difficulty. "Miss Wells," he said. She put her book down. "I do not have adequate words for what happened today," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He was ready. Something simply needed to loosen it." "You," Andrew said, "you loosened it." She looked at him steadily. "He trusted me enough," she said. "That trust is his, Mr. Calloway. And yours, because you raised a boy who knows what it means to trust someone." He came further into the room and sat in his chair, and the fire was going well, and outside the wind was up, and he said, "I want you to know that I am grateful to you, genuinely, in a way that I am not able to express correctly." "You express yourself very well," she said, with a kind of gentle directness that made him look at her. There was a moment between them then, one of those moments that have a texture to them, that you can feel in the air as something happening, and Andrew was aware of it with the same certainty that he was aware of the fire's warmth and the wind's sound, and he thought that she was aware of it too, and neither of them said anything about it. And eventually the conversation moved back to practical matters, to Samuel's progress and what Theodora planned to do with the words now that there were words to work with. And they talked until nearly 10 o'clock, which was later than either of them usually stayed up. And when Theodora said good night and went upstairs, Andrew sat in his chair for another quarter of an hour listening to the fire and the wind and acknowledging to himself that he was in a situation that required very careful navigation. He was her employer. She was in his house to teach his son. She was a professional woman of independent means and clear character who had made specific and reasonable arrangements for her own life, and he had no right to complicate those arrangements based on an evening fire and a gratitude so large it felt like something else. He went to bed and slept badly and was up before dawn to ride out with Pete and check the cattle, which was the most reliable cure he knew for thinking too much. December arrived, and Samuel was speaking every day. Not freely, not the way he had before Eleanor died, but consistently and purposefully. He had a small vocabulary of spoken words that he added to slowly and carefully, as if each word cost something, and he wanted to be certain of its value before spending it. He still relied heavily on the gestural system he had developed with Theodora, and she had written it all down in a notebook that she gave Andrew so that he could understand and respond correctly. She had also begun actual reading lessons, and Samuel, who had learned his letters and sounds with a particular intensity, was combining them into words on the page with something that Andrew could only describe as hunger. Theodora was writing letters to the family of the deaf girl she had taught in Santa Fe, updating them on her new situation, and she received letters back from several of the families she had worked with. Andrew sometimes saw these letters on her writing table when he passed her room and did not read them, but was aware of them as evidence of a life that extended beyond the ranch, a full life with relationships and history and obligations, and this awareness was useful to him when the firelight evenings made him forget it. He was not confused about what he felt. He had been married long enough and lived long enough to know what it meant when a woman's voice was the first thing you noticed in a quiet room, when you found reasons to mention things to her that you did not strictly need to mention, when you caught yourself looking at her hands while she wrote notes in her notebook and had to remind yourself to look elsewhere. He was not confused. He was simply disciplined, or trying to be, and the discipline was becoming progressively more difficult. The complication arrived in the form of a man named Chester Howell, who was the younger brother of a rancher south of Cimarron, and who had apparently heard about the schoolteacher at the Calloway ranch from someone in town, because he appeared one Saturday afternoon in December with a very thin pretense of business for Andrew that was visibly a pretense for all present. He was perhaps 30, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from being the younger son in a prosperous family, and he directed a very significant quantity of charm at Theodora over the course of a half-hour visit that Andrew found trying in ways he preferred not to examine. After Chester Howell left, Pete appeared from somewhere and said with great innocence, "Friendly fellow," and Andrew gave him a look that caused Pete to find somewhere else to be. Theodora, who had been perfectly polite to Chester Howell and showed no particular interest in his considerable charm offensive, looked at Andrew with a slight lift of her brow and said, "He was very determined." "He usually is," Andrew said, which was the most he trusted himself to say. A week later, Chester Howell sent a note to the ranch addressed to Miss Wells, which Andrew delivered to her door, and he did not look at the note itself, and he was proud of himself for this restraint, and also moderately miserable about it. He did not ask about the note. He waited, and the wait had a quality to it that he suspected said more about him than he wanted it to say. 3 days later, Theodora mentioned at breakfast, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for practical information, that she had written a reply to Mr. Howell thanking him for his interest and indicating that she was fully occupied with her current work, and not in a position to accept social invitations. She said this while cutting bread and not looking at Andrew, and Andrew, who was looking at her, felt something unknot in his chest that had been very tight for 3 days. He said neutrally, "I see." She glanced up and caught him looking, and he looked away, and Samuel, who was at the table with them, looked from one to the other with his dark, perceptive eyes and said, very clearly, "Bread." He held up his plate. The moment dissolved into the ordinary, and Andrew was almost grateful. Christmas came to the ranch with a cold that turned the creek to solid glass overnight, and left frost on every fence post and window pane. Theodora had never celebrated Christmas in New Mexico before, and she said so with a kind of pleasure at the novelty. Andrew had Pete bring in a juniper tree from the hills, which was not the pine tree tradition he had grown up with, but which was what the land offered, and he and Samuel and Theodora decorated it together with the ornaments Eleanor had collected over the years of their marriage, small painted wooden shapes and a few precious glass ones that had come from the East in a crate packed with sawdust. Samuel handled each ornament with tremendous care, and Andrew told him where they had come from, which ones his mother had bought at the market in Taos, which one a ranch hand named Joaquin had carved out of mesquite wood as a gift, which ones had been gifts from his grandmother. Samuel listened to these stories with his whole body, and occasionally he spoke, asking for confirmation of something. "Mama," pointing to a particular blue glass bird, and Andrew saying, "Yes, that one she had bought herself at the market the summer before you were born." Theodora was stringing dried berries she had bought in town, and she paused in her work to look at Andrew when he said this, and the look was soft and serious, and he held it for a moment before returning his attention to Samuel. On Christmas Eve, Theodora came downstairs after Samuel was in bed carrying a small wrapped package, which she gave to Andrew with a directness that precluded any embarrassment. She said, "I made it. It is not much." He opened it and found a hand-bound book of paper, filled from front to back with Theodora's clear handwriting. It was a record of every word Samuel had spoken since November, with dates and contexts and Theodora's own observations about what had preceded each word and what it seemed to mean to the boy. It was a document of the boy's return to language, meticulous and warm, and it was the most practical and the most generous gift Andrew could imagine receiving. He sat with it in his hands for a moment. He said, "Miss Wells." He stopped. He tried again. "Theodora." Her first name in his mouth did something to both of them. She went very still. "This is remarkable," he said. "Thank you." She nodded once, and there was something in her that seemed to be waiting, though he could not have said what for, and perhaps she did not know either. He had a gift for her as well. He had thought about it for 3 weeks and had gone to Cimarron twice to find the right thing. He gave her a small box, and inside the box was a pen of genuine quality, the kind she did not have but clearly needed, because the one she used was scratchy and required frequent dipping. He had also included, wrapped separately, a new blank notebook, larger than the one she used and with better paper. She opened the pen first and looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked at him, and something in her face that was usually slightly guarded had opened. "How did you know?" she asked. "I have seen you frustrated with your pen," he said. "Often." She laughed then, which was a sound he had been collecting without quite realizing it, the different varieties of it. The quiet laugh she gave at Samuel's drawings, the sharper one when Pete said something unexpectedly funny, the rarer and fuller one that she gave at something that genuinely surprised her. This laugh was the latter kind, and he thought he had never heard a better sound in that room. "Andrew," she said, using his given name as he had used hers, deliberate and reciprocal. He did not say anything. Neither did she. But the room was warmer than the fire alone accounted for, and when she said good night her voice had a quality to it that he carried up to bed with him and did not examine too closely, because if he examined it he would have to act on it, and he was still not certain that acting on it was the right thing to do. January brought the hardest cold, and with it, a crisis that arrived without warning and required Andrew's attention for 4 straight days. 3 of his cowhands had gone to ride the eastern range, and found that a section of fence had been deliberately cut, and 30 head of cattle had wandered through onto the adjacent government land, and 2 of them were missing outright. This was not a minor inconvenience in 1879. Losing cattle was losing money, and losing them to a potentially deliberate act was something that required investigation, careful management, and significant time in the saddle in weather that was punishing. Andrew was gone from the ranch house for most of 4 days, riding with Pete and 2 other hands, finding the cattle, repairing the fence, making inquiries in town about who might have had reason to cut it, which pointed toward a land dispute that had been simmering between the Calloway Ranch and a speculator named Dalton who had been trying to buy adjacent acreage for 2 years and growing hostile about Andrew's refusal to sell. Andrew handled the situation with the controlled steadiness that characterized him in all business matters, speaking clearly with the territorial sheriff's office in Cimarron, documenting what had happened, making it known in the quiet but definitive way of a man who has run land for a long time that he was not someone who could be pressured. The land dispute did not escalate into anything worse, because Dalton was a speculator rather than a violent man, interested in profit rather than confrontation, and Andrew's demonstration that he was both prepared and paying attention was sufficient to make the fence cutting a singular event. But he was tired when he came home. 4 days in January cold on horseback left a specific kind of tiredness in the bones, and he came in late on the 4th evening to find the ranch house warm and lit, and Theodora had kept dinner for him, not just kept it but kept it properly warm, and there was fresh bread as well, which she must have made that afternoon. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his trail coat and looked at this evidence of consideration, and Theodora came in from the main room and looked at him and said simply, "Sit down. I will get it." He sat down. He was too tired to argue, and besides, he did not want to. She brought the food and poured coffee, and she sat across from him while he ate, and she told him about the 4 days with Samuel, what they had worked on, how Samuel had asked about his father 3 separate times using full short sentences. She said, He asked where you were going and when you would be back, and I told him, and he seemed reassured by the information. She paused. He is a boy who needs information. He does not do well with uncertainty. He is his mother's son in that, Andrew said. She looked at him with that soft, serious look. He is yours in other ways, she said. The way he is steady when he has made up his mind about something, that is you. Andrew set down his fork. He was looking at her and she was looking at him, and the kitchen was warm and quiet, and he thought, I am going to say it or I am not going to say it, and if I do not say it now I do not know when I will, or if I ever will, and that possibility is worse than the risk of saying it. He said, Theodora, I find myself in a situation I had not anticipated when I wrote that letter to you in September. She was very still. I want to be honest with you, he said, because I think you deserve honesty, and because I think dishonesty between people who share a house and a responsibility for a child is not sustainable. She said quietly, Go on. I have developed feelings for you, he said. That is a plain way of saying it, but I am a plain person, and the plain truth is that I think about you more than is professionally appropriate, and I am aware that you are here in a professional capacity, and I do not want to make this arrangement uncomfortable or to create any situation in which you feel that your employment depends on responding to my feelings in any particular way. I want you to know that it does not. Whatever you say in response to this, nothing about your place here or your work with Samuel changes. He stopped talking. The kitchen was very quiet. Theodora looked at her coffee cup, and then she looked at him, and when she looked at him her face was open in a way he had not seen before. She said, I have been trying to determine for approximately 3 months whether I was misreading things, because misreading things would have been a significant professional error, and I prefer not to make significant professional errors. He looked at her. Were you misreading things? No, she said. I was not. The word between them settled like a stone finding the bottom of still water. He said, I do not know how to proceed from here. I want to be clear that I am not a man who moves quickly or carelessly. I know that about you, she said. And I want to be sure that you are here because you want to be, he said, not because Samuel's progress makes leaving feel complicated. She looked at him with something that was almost impatience but kind. Andrew, she said, I have had opportunities to leave. I have had a letter from a school in Albuquerque asking if I would consider a permanent position. I have not replied to it. He was quiet for a moment. When did that letter arrive? 2 weeks ago. He absorbed this. She had not replied to a letter offering her a permanent position. She had not mentioned it to him. He thought about what that meant and what it said about the care with which she had been proceeding, and something in him that had been held in restraint for months loosened significantly. He said, What would you want? If we proceeded, what would you want it to look like? She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. I want to continue with Samuel, she said. His progress is the most important thing in this house, and any change in its circumstances needs to account for that. She paused. And I want to continue the evenings, she said more quietly. The conversations. I have not had conversations like that since my mother died, with someone who listens the way you listen. He thought that might be the most honest thing she had said to him yet, and it landed in him with a warmth that he felt in his hands. Then we proceed, he said, carefully and honestly, she nodded. Carefully and honestly, she agreed. He reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers briefly, the same way Samuel sometimes did to communicate something that words did not quite cover, and she looked at his hand on hers and then at him, and whatever was in her face was something he intended to spend a considerable amount of time learning to read. February arrived, and the world between them had shifted into something neither of them rushed. Andrew found that he was someone who wanted to do this properly, not out of convention alone, but out of a genuine desire to build something that would hold. He began inviting Theodora to join him on certain tasks around the ranch, not as assistant, but as company, the way a man invites someone he wants to know better into the parts of his life he cares most about. He showed her the horses, the particular personalities of them, and found that she had a genuine interest in animals that she had not displayed broadly because the context had not invited it. She was not a rider, or she had not been, but she was willing to learn, and by late February she could sit a gentle mare named Bess without looking as though she expected to fall off at any moment. Pete Vasquez watched all of this with an expression of profound satisfaction that he deployed carefully when Andrew was not looking, and sometimes when he was. Samuel was watching too. Children who are quiet are often more observant than adults account for, and Samuel had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stillness, and a 6-year-old's perfect attention to everything that happened in his world. He began to place himself near both of them when they were in the same space, a tendency so deliberate that Theodora noticed it and mentioned it to Andrew one evening, saying, "I think he is very comfortable with the current arrangement." Andrew had said simply, "So am I." She had smiled at that, a full and warm smile without her usual slight guardedness, and he had filed it carefully. In March, Andrew asked Theodora to accompany him to Cimarron for the Saturday market, which was a social as well as commercial event, and she agreed, and they brought Samuel, and the three of them walking through the market together produced precisely the quality of observation from Cimarron's residents that could be expected, which was thorough and barely concealed. Mrs. Abernathy at the general store managed to reference "your little family" in a sentence that was technically about purchasing flour, and Andrew did not correct her because correcting her would have required discussing the situation, and he preferred not to discuss the situation publicly until it was further along. Theodora bought Samuel a small hand-carved horse from a craftsman's stall, and Samuel carried it for the rest of the day as though it were made of something precious, which to him it probably was. He told Andrew in his careful, considered way, "Theo gave me a horse." Andrew said yes, she did, and Samuel nodded with great satisfaction. Walking back to the wagon with Theodora at his side and Samuel between them, occasionally reaching for either of their hands when the crowd was thick, Andrew was aware of himself as belonging to a particular configuration, and he thought that he had not felt this particular kind of belonging in a very long time. He said quietly, while Samuel was examining a fence post with an interesting knot in it ahead of them, "Theodora," she turned to him, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it correctly, so I am telling you that I am going to ask it and giving you time to prepare." She looked at him with a kind of fond exasperation. "You are very formal sometimes," she said. "I know," he said. "I will ask you tonight." He asked her that evening by the fire, after Samuel was in bed, with the directness he had promised himself he would use and without unnecessary ceremony. He told her that he wanted her to stay, not as Samuel's tutor, though that could continue for as long as she wanted it to, but as something that would eventually mean staying permanently, if that was what she wanted. He said he was not in a position to offer her anything glamorous, only a ranch and a good piece of land and a son who already called her by name, and himself, which was what it was, a man who was quieter than most and harder to know than he probably appeared, and who had been doing his level best to be worth knowing. Theodora looked at him for a long time after he finished, long enough that he had time to feel several varieties of uncertainty, and then she said, "Andrew, I came to this ranch in October expecting to do a job and leave in the spring. I am not leaving in the spring." He said, "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes," she said, "with the condition that we continue to be honest with each other the way we have been." "That is already my preference," he said. She reached over and took his hand, deliberately this time, not the glancing contact of the kitchen table but a full, warm clasp, and he held it. And the fire went on burning, and outside the March wind was dropping, and Andrew Calloway thought that the house felt the way it had once felt a long time ago, inhabited even in the quiet. April came with a softening of the air and the first green along the creek, and Andrew rode into Cimarron to speak with Reverend Moss about the formalities of the matter, which he did not find uncomfortable in the way he had feared he might. Reverend Moss was a straightforward man of a practical faith who was pleased to see Andrew Calloway showing signs of human engagement again, and he asked no intrusive questions and offered no unsolicited advice, and said he would be ready whenever Andrew and Miss Wells chose to present themselves. Andrew had spoken to Theodora before going to see the Reverend, asking what kind of ceremony she wanted, and she had said something small and real, nothing performative, and he had said that suited him exactly. He had also asked Samuel, in a serious and careful way, sitting down with the boy after breakfast one morning, and explaining to him what marriage meant in terms Samuel could understand, that Theodora was going to stay, not just for teaching but always, and that she would be part of their family. Samuel had listened to this with his total attention, sitting very still. When Andrew finished, Samuel had looked at him for a long moment, and then he had said, clearly enough to be unmistakable, "Good." He looked at his hands and then back at his father. "She stays." Andrew had said, "Yes, she stays." Samuel had nodded once with great finality and asked if they could go see the horses. They were married on the first Saturday of May, 1879, at the Cimarron Church, with Pete Vasquez and his wife Maria standing as witnesses and Samuel sitting in the front pew with the carved horse Theodora had bought him, wearing his good clothes with an air of seriousness that made Theodora laugh quietly before the ceremony began, which loosened everything. Reverend Moss kept it short and true, and Theodora said her vows in her clear, steady voice, looking directly at Andrew, and Andrew said his looking directly at her, and neither of them looked away. Afterward, there was a dinner at the ranch that Maria Vasquez and Mrs. Abernathy had conspired to organize without being asked, which produced a table full of food and a room full of people, most of the ranch hands and their wives, and a handful of Cimarron residents who considered themselves connected to the Calloway household in one way or another. Pete made a toast that was short and emotional, and Samuel sat next to Theodora for the entire meal and ate a significant quantity of cake. That evening, when the guests had gone and Samuel was in bed and the house was quiet again, Andrew and Theodora sat on the front porch in the last of the spring evening, the air warm and the sky enormous above the dark hills, thick with stars in the way that New Mexico skies are thick with stars, extravagantly and almost unbelievably. Theodora leaned her shoulder against his arm, and he put his arm around her, and she settled into that space with the ease of something that had been waiting to happen. She said, "It is a very fine view." He looked at her profile in the starlight and he thought, "You said that when you first arrived, sitting on the step with Samuel." He did not say this aloud. He simply held her closer, and she turned her face and looked at him, and what passed between them in that look was the full weight of what they had come to, not just today but over the previous 7 months, the letters, the fire-lit evenings, the bird burial, the first word, the kitchen confession, all of it compressed into one clear moment. He said, "Theodora." She said, "Andrew." And the stars continued their enormous indifference overhead, while the two of them sat together on the porch of a house that was once again full. Summer arrived in the way New Mexico summers do, all at once and without apology, the heat coming down hard from a sky bleached nearly white by noon, and only yielding in the late afternoon when the thunderheads built over the mountains and rolled toward the valley. Theodora had grown up in the milder climate of central New Mexico, and the Cimarron summer was somewhat more muscular than she had anticipated. But she adapted with the same pragmatic flexibility she brought to everything, wearing lighter clothing and doing her most active work in the mornings, and she did not complain, which Andrew noticed and appreciated because he had known people who complained about the summer at length. Samuel's speech continued to develop through the summer in a pattern that Theodora had explained to Andrew early on, and that proved exactly right. The words came in small quantities but were used with great precision, each one chosen and placed deliberately. By June he was speaking in short sentences, by July in complete ones. He still had a tendency to go quiet for stretches, particularly when he was thinking hard about something or was in a new situation. But the silence now felt different, temporary rather than permanent, a pause rather than a wall. He was also reading. Genuinely reading, following the words on a page with his finger and producing sounds for them. And the look on his face when a sentence resolved itself into meaning was something Andrew tried not to stare at too obviously because it moved him too much. Theodora had given him a book of natural history with drawings of animals, and Samuel carried it with him much as he carried the carved horse, and he referred to it constantly, confirming things he saw in the natural world against its descriptions, and occasionally reporting his findings to Andrew or Theodora with the gravity of a scientist. One afternoon in July, Andrew found Samuel and Theodora sitting under the cottonwood trees along the creek, with the natural history book open between them and a dead grasshopper on a flat stone beside it, which Samuel had apparently been comparing to the illustration in the book. Samuel looked up when Andrew approached and said, in a perfectly clear and conversational tone, "Papa, this is a short-horned grasshopper. The book says so." Andrew crouched down and looked at the grasshopper and the illustration. "The book is right," he said. Samuel nodded. "Thea, help me find the page," he said. Theodora was watching them both with a smile that she was not quite containing. "She is very good at that," Andrew said. Samuel considered this. "Yes," he said, "she is good at a lot of things." Andrew met Theodora's eyes over their son's head, and what moved between them was quiet and warm and complete. In the fall of 1879, Theodora began teaching a small class in addition to her work with Samuel. This had been her idea, presented to Andrew one evening as something she wanted to do rather than something she needed his permission for, which he had appreciated, though he had also noted that she watched his face carefully while she said it, and he had made certain to show that his response was interest and support rather than any kind of resistance. There were several children on neighboring ranches and in town who had no access to formal schooling, and Theodora proposed to hold classes twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday mornings, in the large room at the back of the ranch house, which was underused. Andrew helped her set it up, carrying in the small blackboard she had brought from Santa Fe and 3 additional chairs and a second table, and Pete Vasquez's daughter, who was 8 years old and named Rosa, became the first additional student, followed by 2 boys from the Ortega Ranch to the east. Samuel loved having other children in the house. He was cautious in his social engagements, which was his nature, but he was also genuinely interested in people, and having Rosa and the Ortega brothers twice a week was good for him in ways that Theodora had predicted, and that Andrew watched with the particular pleasure of a man who is seeing something he desperately wanted come to pass. The one evening in October, exactly 1 year after Theodora had arrived on the stage from Santa Fe, she told Andrew at dinner, in her direct and measured way, that she believed she was expecting a child. Andrew set down his fork. Samuel was at the table and looked from one parent to the other with his perceptive gaze. Andrew said, "Are you certain?" "Reasonably," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair, and he put his hands over hers on the table and he said very quietly, "Theodora." She looked at him with something wide open in her face. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling very well," she said. "I feel completely fine. I wanted you to know." He held her hands and looked at her, and he thought of everything the year had contained. The October arrival and the November word and the December firelight and the spring wedding and the summer of grasshoppers and natural history books, and now this, and the arithmetic of it was almost too large for a kitchen table. Samuel, who had been very quietly paying attention, said, "Is there going to be a baby?" Andrew turned to look at his son. "Yes," Theodora said. "In the spring, we think." Samuel considered this with his customary seriousness. "A baby," he said, testing the word. "Will it be loud?" Theodora laughed, full and warm, the laugh that Andrew had been collecting. "Probably," she said. Samuel nodded slowly, apparently reconciling himself to this likelihood. "Okay," he said, and returned to his dinner. Andrew stayed crouched beside Theodora's chair for a moment longer, and she rested her forehead briefly against his temple, and it was not a large gesture, but it said everything about the year they had built. The pregnancy was uncomplicated in the practical sense, which Andrew was grateful for every day in a way that was inseparable from his awareness of what could go wrong, because he had sat with Alina through a fever that the doctor could not manage, and he was not someone who took health for granted. He drove Theodora to Cimarron to see Dr. Hatch in November, and Dr. Hatch pronounced everything as it should be, and Andrew shook the man's hand with a firmness that communicated the depth of his investment in this assessment. Theodora continued to teach through the winter, adjusting her schedule as the pregnancy progressed, and she continued to work with Samuel, whose reading by Christmas was genuinely fluent, and who was writing short sentences in a hand that Theodora called careful and Andrew called identical to his own, which made Theodora look at Andrew's handwriting on the ranch accounts with new attention. "You form your letters very distinctly," she said. "My mother was particular about it," he said. "I would have liked your mother," Theodora said. He looked at her across the accounts desk and thought that his mother, who had been a woman of strong opinions and clear standards, would have approved of Theodora Wells with a completeness that she reserved for very few people. "Yes," he said. "She would have made you prove it, but she would have liked you." The boy was born in April of 1880, on a clear morning that arrived after a night of rain, and the world outside was bright and clean and smelled of wet earth. Dr. Hatch came out from Cimarron, and Maria Vasquez came to help, and Andrew stayed, because Theodora had asked him to stay and he had wanted nothing else. The labor was long, and Andrew found that he was someone who did not handle the helplessness of it well, which he had suspected but which was confirmed definitively, and he held Theodora's hand with a steadiness he was performing at least partially for her benefit, and which she later told him had mattered very much. The boy was healthy and loud, and had a quantity of dark hair that made Theodora laugh the moment she saw him. She looked at Andrew with the boy in her arms and said, "He looks exactly like you." Andrew looked at his son, the new one, and the feeling that moved through him was enormous and almost frightening in its size. He said, "He looks better than me," and Theodora laughed again. Samuel, who had been kept in the kitchen with Pete during the delivery, was brought in when everything was settled and the room was quiet and Theodora was sitting up with the baby wrapped against her. Samuel stood in the doorway looking at the scene with extreme attention, and Andrew said, "Come here, Sam." And Samuel came carefully and stood by the bed and looked at his brother. He said after a long moment, "He is very small." "He will grow," Theodora said. Samuel looked at her and then at Andrew and then at the baby. He said, "What is his name?" Andrew and Theodora had talked about names at length over the winter. They had one they had agreed on, one that contained something from both their families and from the life they had built. Andrew looked at Theodora and she nodded. "His name is Elias," Andrew said. "Elias Daniel Calloway." Samuel repeated it quietly to himself, trying it. "Elias," he said. He looked at his brother. "Hello, Elias," he said, with a grave and complete seriousness that made both Andrew and Theodora exchange a look over his head that contained the full weight of how far they had come. The spring and summer of 1880 were full in the way that houses with small children are full, with noise and movement, and the particular exhaustion that is not entirely unpleasant because it is the exhaustion of things thriving. Elias was a vigorous and vocal baby who made his presence known at all hours, and who seemed to regard sleep as an optional activity, which Andrew managed with the same stoic patience he brought to the difficult seasons of ranching, and which Theodora managed with a practicality he found deeply admirable. Samuel was 7 years old and had appointed himself his brother's primary observer, reporting Elias' activities to Andrew and Theodora with the thoroughness of a scientific recorder. Elias rolled over today, delivered with the gravity of a major geological event. Elias appears to be looking at the lamp, offered as significant data. He was, in his steady and deliberate way, becoming a big brother, and watching him do it was one of the best things Andrew had ever seen. The school in the back room had grown to 6 students by summer, and Theodora had spoken to Reverend Moss about eventually establishing a formal school in Cimarron, a conversation that was preliminary but that Andrew could see was a genuine intention on her part, and he supported it fully, because she was too good at this work to limit it to one ranch, and because she had never struck him as someone who had come into his life to make herself smaller. In the fall of 1880, something happened that brought the larger world pressing against the edges of their life in a way that could not be ignored. A group of men came through the Cimarron area associated with the ongoing range conflicts that had been simmering in the territory, an extension of troubles that stretched south toward Lincoln County and that most ranchers in the area were trying carefully to stay out of. The men were not violent on Calloway land, but they passed through it, and one evening 3 of them came to the ranch house door asking for water and food, which Andrew provided because he was not a man who denied water to anyone in the New Mexico climate. But he also made it very clear, standing in his doorway with Pete visible behind him and the rifle on its rack visible behind that passing through was the extent of what he would be providing. Theodora had taken Samuel and Elias to the back of the house during this exchange, and when the men were gone and Andrew came in, she was waiting in the kitchen with a calmness that he recognized as the controlled variety. She said, "Are we safe here?" He said honestly. "Those men are not interested in us. They are passing through, but I am going to have Pete and 2 others sleeping in the bunkhouse close for the next week, and I want you to keep the children away from the road." She nodded. She did not argue or minimize or perform a fear she did not feel. She asked practical questions, accepted his answers, and said, "Then we manage it." He looked at her and thought, "Yes, that is what we do. We manage it together." The threat passed as he had predicted, moving on with the larger currents of trouble that eventually resolved themselves through the territorial government and the Army's presence, as the range wars in New Mexico territory ground toward their conclusion. Cimarron was not Lincoln County, and Andrew Calloway's land was not contested in any way that invited the kind of violence that made newspaper headlines. They were not untouched by the territory's tensions, but they were not destroyed by them either, and by winter the extra precautions were no longer necessary, and the days resumed their ordinary rhythm. By the following spring, when Elias was taking his first uncertain steps across the kitchen floor and Samuel was 8 and reading chapter books and speaking in the full, complete way of a child who has made language his own, Andrew sat one morning on the porch steps with his coffee and looked out at the hills and the creek and the cottonwoods coming into new leaves, and Theodora came out and sat beside him, the way she had learned to do from watching Samuel, close enough to share the view. He said, "Do you know what I was doing this time 2 years ago?" She said, "Writing a letter." He smiled. "Writing a very difficult letter to a schoolteacher in Santa Fe," he said, who he had been told might be able to help. She leaned her shoulder against his arm. And was she able to help? He turned to look at her, and the morning light was on her face, and the 2 years of mornings was in his chest, a weight that was entirely the comfortable kind, the weight of accumulated days that had been worth living. She was able to do considerably more than that, he said. She held his gaze in the way she had without looking away when it mattered, and she said, "So was he." The morning went on around them, the horses moving in the corral, the sound of Elias babbling from somewhere inside the house, the distant purposeful sound of Pete and the hands beginning the day's work, and the enormous New Mexico sky going from pale to blue above the hills, the same sky that had looked down on all of it, the grief and the silence and the first word and the first name spoken, and the evenings by the fire and the vows and the new life and the continuing life, the whole accumulation of it. Ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. By the summer of 1881, Samuel was 9 years old and had become one of the most fluent readers in the area, a fact that Theodora mentioned with great satisfaction when speaking with Reverend Moss, and the local school board about the establishment of a proper schoolhouse in Cimarron, which had been her ongoing campaign for the past year, and which was now, finally, moving toward a real conclusion. The town had grown enough that the argument for a dedicated school building was practical as well as principled, and Theodora had made the case with the same direct, evidence-based style she brought to everything, and Andrew had supported it in the way a man supports something his wife believes in, which is to say quietly and completely and by showing up at the meetings. The schoolhouse was approved in August of 1881 and would be built that fall, a single room with good windows and a proper blackboard and enough desks for 12 students to start. Theodora was asked to be its first teacher, a formal appointment with a formal salary paid by the town's education committee, and she accepted with a composure that concealed a satisfaction so large that Andrew saw it the moment she came home and told him. He had been in the barn with Samuel when she came in, and she had stood in the barn doorway with the afternoon light behind her and said, simply, "They approved it," and Andrew had looked at her face and known exactly what it meant. Samuel, who understood more than people sometimes remembered he understood, had looked at Theodora and then at his father and said, "What did they approve?" Andrew said, "The schoolhouse." Samuel thought about this. He said, "Theo's school." "Yes," Andrew said, "Theo's school." Samuel looked at Theodora with an expression that was entirely his father's, steady and certain and containing more than it showed. He said, "Good." And then, after a pause, he said, "I helped with that." Theodora laughed, and Andrew laughed too, and Samuel looked satisfied in the way of someone who has made an accurate accounting. The ranch had had a good year, the cattle healthy and the prices fair, and Andrew had put money into the south pasture fencing and a new section of the creek irrigation that would improve the summer grazing. He was not a man who counted his prosperity loudly, but he was a man who knew the difference between surviving and thriving, and by the fall of 1881 they were thriving, not extravagantly but genuinely, in the solid, sustainable way of a place that has been built carefully. Elias, at 18 months, had become mobile and opinionated and entirely devoted to following Samuel everywhere, which Samuel accepted with a patience that Andrew recognized as his own. Samuel would walk slowly to accommodate his brother's uncertain gait, and would narrate what they were looking at in the yard in the same way that Theodora had once narrated things to him. And Andrew would watch this from the porch sometimes and feel something in him that was too large for a single word. On an evening in October of 1881, 3 years to the month since Theodora had arrived on the stage from Santa Fe, Andrew and Theodora sat on the porch after supper, both boys in bed, the air cool and full of the smell of autumn, and Theodora said, "I have been thinking." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I want to write it down. What happened with Samuel and how we worked through it. I have been corresponding with a physician in Santa Fe who works with children who do not speak, and he thinks a written account of the methods might be useful for other families." Andrew turned to look at her. He said, "You should do that," she said. "It would take time, evenings mostly." "Then take the evenings," he said. "Take whatever you need." She looked at him steadily. "You are sure?" "Theodora," he said, "if there is a family somewhere with a child like Samuel was, and what you write helps them, then those are the most important evenings you could spend." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You are a very good man, Andrew Calloway." He looked at his hands. He said, "I'm a man who has been made better by having you in his house." She reached over and took his hand, and they sat in the October evening the way they had learned to sit together, comfortable in the silence. Not because they had nothing to say, but because the silence between them was not empty. She began writing the account over the following weeks, in the evenings at her writing table, using the pen he had given her their first Christmas, which she had maintained and used every day since. Andrew would sometimes bring her coffee without interrupting, setting the cup at the edge of the table and leaving, and she would look up and thank him with a look that contained 3 years of accumulated knowledge of each other. The account was finished in the spring of 1882, and she sent it to the physician in Santa Fe, and 3 months later he wrote back that he had shared it with colleagues in Albuquerque and in Santa Fe itself, and that it was being read with great interest. This was the beginning of something that grew slowly and steadily over the following years, a correspondence with physicians and educators across the territory who were working with silent children, a set of ideas that spread in the way that useful ideas spread, quietly and without fanfare, through the networks of people who needed them. Theodora never made much of this beyond the work itself. She continued teaching at the Cimarron schoolhouse, which by 1882 had 20 students and was talking about expanding, and she continued her work with the ranch household with the same attention and energy she brought to everything. And she continued the evenings with Andrew, which were as full and honest as they had ever been, ranging over everything from the day's practical matters to the books she was reading to the nature of New Mexico politics, to the memories that surface sometimes of Alina, of Theodora's mother, of the people they had been before they found each other. In the spring of 1883, Theodora told Andrew over breakfast, while Elias was attempting to feed himself from a bowl of porridge with a spoon that was too large for him, that she was expecting again. Samuel, who was 10 and had become someone who followed the news of the household with the interest of a junior historian, looked up from his own breakfast. He said, "Another baby." "Yes," Theodora said. Samuel thought about this. He said, "Will this one also be loud?" "Probably," Theodora said. Samuel absorbed this with equanimity. He said, "Elias got quieter eventually." "That is true," Andrew agreed. Elias, who was 2.5 and had opinions about being discussed as though not present, said, "I am not quiet," and hit his spoon against the bowl for emphasis. The child born in November of 1883 was a girl, and she arrived in the world with an energy that impressed even Dr. Hatch, who had attended a considerable number of births in his time. She had Theodora's auburn hair and Andrew's dark eyes, and an extremely clear sense of herself from approximately the first hour. They named her Clara Alina, and when Samuel met her, he held her with a seriousness and care that made Andrew have to look out the window for a moment. Clara Alina Calloway grew up with 2 older brothers, a father who was steady as bedrock and who read to her every evening without fail, and a mother who taught her to read before she was 4 and whose school she eventually attended along with 30 other children of the growing town. And Cimarron did grow. The territory was changing, the railroad pushing through other parts of New Mexico and drawing commerce and population. And while Cimarron itself remained a town of modest size, it became more connected to the larger world, and the Calloway Ranch grew with it, Andrew buying additional grazing land to the north in 1884 when the opportunity presented itself, and the cattle operation becoming substantial enough to require a regular hired manager to handle the commercial side, which freed Andrew for the work he was best at, which was the land itself. Samuel, at 12, told Andrew one evening that he wanted to be a doctor someday. He said it with the same quiet certainty with which he said everything important, sitting across from Andrew at the desk in the study, looking at the books on the shelf. He said, "Theodora says there are schools in the East that teach medicine." Andrew looked at his son, this boy who had once sat in total silence for 2 years and who now spoke with such deliberate clarity. He said, "We will find you a school." Samuel nodded once. He said, "I want to help children who cannot talk yet, like I was." Andrew was quiet for a moment. He said, "Samuel, that is a fine thing to want." Samuel shrugged slightly, the way children shrug at things that seem obvious to them. "Theodora helped me," he said. Someone should do that for other children. Theodora was in the kitchen and could not have heard the conversation, but Andrew told her that evening, and she sat very still while he told her, and when he finished she pressed her lips together briefly and then said, in her steadiest voice, "Then we will make sure he goes." They did make sure. It would be years away still, but they began saving with purpose, and Theodora wrote letters to medical schools and corresponded with the physician in Santa Fe who had become a genuine colleague, and the future that Samuel had named for himself became something they all moved toward together. The way the Calloway Ranch had always moved through difficult terrain, carefully and with full attention. By the time Clara was 5 and Elias was 8 and Samuel was 13, the ranch house had expanded too. A new room added to the east side that gave everyone more space, and that had windows with the right morning light, which Theodora had specified, and which Andrew had built accordingly, because he had long since learned that her specifications were worth following. The kitchen garden had been restored, not to Aline's exact version, but to Theodora's, which was larger and more practical, and included herbs and vegetables in quantities sufficient to actually feed a family of 5 plus occasional hands. Pete Vasquez had built his own small house on the property with Andrew's blessing, and Maria and Rosa and the younger Vasquez children were a constant presence, and the life of the ranch had the texture of a community rather than just a household, which was something Andrew had not known he wanted until he had it. One evening in the fall of 1886, Andrew and Theodora were in the study after the children were in bed, Theodora reviewing the year's school accounts and Andrew going over the ranch ledger, and the lamplight was low and warm, and outside the October wind moved through the cottonwoods exactly as it had on every October evening before this one, and Theodora looked up from her papers and said, without particular preamble, "Andrew." He looked up. She said, "Are you happy?" He set down his pen. He looked at her across the desk, this woman with the auburn hair that had some silver in it now at 34, and the clear eyes that saw everything, and the hands that had always known how to reach for the right tool, and he said, "I did not know it was possible to be this happy. I think I had forgotten that the word applied to something achievable." She held his gaze the way she always did. She said, "So had I." He got up from his side of the desk and came around to her side, and she turned her chair toward him, and he took her face in both his roughened hands with a gentleness that had surprised him the first time he discovered he possessed it and no longer surprised him at all, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back with 3 years, then 4, then 8 years of accumulated certainty behind it. She said against his mouth, "I intend to stay considerably longer." He said, "Good." In 1888, Samuel Calloway, now 15, received a letter confirming that when he reached the age of 18, he had been provisionally accepted at the medical college in Philadelphia, pending a renewed application at that time. Theodora had written the letter of application herself, with Samuel's knowledge and direction, and the physician in Santa Fe had written a letter of recommendation, and the provisional acceptance arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Samuel read it 3 times at the kitchen table and then said, in his deliberate way, "I will need to work very hard between now and then." Theodora said, "You have never not worked hard." Samuel looked at her with his father's steadiness and his mother's eyes and said, "You taught me that." Theodora looked at the letter in her hands and then at this boy who had once sat silent on a porch step and who had said her name first, and she said carefully, "Samuel, you taught yourself. I only found the bridge." Samuel considered this. He said, "You were a very good bridge." Andrew, who was at the stove, found himself unable to contribute to this conversation for a moment. He kept his back to the room until he was certain of his composure, and then he turned around and said, "We should celebrate. I will ask Maria to make the cake." Elias said, "What kind of cake?" Clara said, "Any kind." Samuel said, "Apple," which was what he always said, which was the kind of thing you know about a person after 9 years of living with them, that they will always choose apple. The years moved. They were not without difficulty, because no years are. The territory of New Mexico was still a place where the larger forces of American expansion pressed against the lives of everyone living there, and the injustices of that expansion were visible if you were someone who looked. The Jicarilla Apache people who had lived in the Cimarron area for generations found themselves in a situation that was worsening through the 1880s and into the 1890s. Confined and constrained by government decisions made at a great distance from the land in question. And Andrew Calloway, who was a man of business and not a politician, nonetheless had dealings with Apache families through trade and through the land itself. And he was not someone who regarded the official policies as anything other than what they were, which was unjust and practically speaking also self-defeating, since it made the land less peaceful for everyone. He said so when it came up, not loudly but clearly, because he had never been a man who believed that silence about wrong things was neutrality. Theodora, at the school, taught children whose families came from several backgrounds, Anglo and Hispanic, and in one case, a half-Apache boy named Thomas whose mother had found a way to enroll him, and she taught them all with the same commitment and refused to make any distinction among them. This caused some friction with one or two parents in the community who had particular views on the matter, and Theodora addressed those views directly and without yielding, which caused Andrew to love her in a way that was entirely beyond his capacity to express adequately. So he expressed it in other ways, by being there, by standing beside her in the practical choices, by continuing to be the man she had said yes to. Samuel left for Philadelphia in 1891, 18 years old, with 2 trunks and a new coat that Theodora had ordered from Santa Fe, and that Andrew had paid for without comment on the cost. The departure was conducted at the Raton Railroad Depot with a composure that was entirely characteristic of all 3 of them, which was to say it was conducted very quietly, and the goodbye between Samuel and Andrew lasted only a moment but was complete, a handshake that became a brief, firm embrace, and Andrew said, "Write to us," and Samuel said, "Every week," and he did. His letters were meticulous and detailed, and full of his observations of the East, of Philadelphia and its noise and its density and its weather, so different from New Mexico that he found himself describing it as though reporting from another country. He described his studies with the same thoroughness he had once applied to grasshopper taxonomy, and Andrew and Theodora read every letter at the dinner table, often to Elias and Clara as well, and the city of Philadelphia became known to all of them through Samuel's eyes. He came home the first Christmas, and the reunion on the ranch porch was one of the moments that Andrew afterward thought of when he wanted to understand what his life had been. Samuel, taller and with the beginning of a young man's gravity about him, coming up the porch steps, and Elias who was 11 and worshipful of his brother, and Clara who was 8 and had no particular reverence for anyone but genuine affection for Samuel, and Theodora, who met him at the top of the steps and held him for a moment with her arms around him, the way she had learned to hold him over 10 years of being his mother in every sense that mattered. Andrew stood back and watched all of it and was entirely satisfied. By 1895, Samuel was 22 and had completed his medical training and was planning to return to New Mexico, not to Cimarron exactly, but to the territory, where doctors who understood the particular realities of that landscape and its people were needed. He had become, in the course of his training, one of the physicians the Philadelphia faculty pointed to when they talked about students who had a particular gift with patients who could not easily communicate their symptoms, children especially, and the path that had started with a 6-year-old boy and a dead bird, and a word said in a warm kitchen had arrived somewhere both inevitable and remarkable. Andrew Calloway was 51 years old in 1895, and he was the same as he had always been in the essential ways, though somewhat slower to rise in the cold months and somewhat more willing to leave the hardest fence work to the younger hands. Theodora was 43, and she was still teaching, and the Cimarron School had 3 teachers now and a proper board of education, and she served on that board as its chair, which she had been asked to do, and had accepted on the condition that they also address the long-standing exclusion of certain children from formal enrollment, which condition the board had accepted because they had learned over many years not to argue with Theodora Wells Calloway when she had made up her mind about something. Elias, at 15, had his father's ranching instincts and had been helping with the cattle operation in earnest for 2 years, and there was every indication that the Calloway ranch would pass into good hands when the time came. Clara, at 12, was a reader of impressive range and a student of everything Theodora put in front of her, and had expressed a strong interest in becoming a teacher herself, which her mother received with a warmth she expressed privately to Andrew, saying, "If she becomes a teacher, I will consider it the greatest professional achievement of my life." And Andrew had said, "You have many great professional achievements." And Theodora had said, "Yes, but this one I made from scratch." The summer of 1895 was long and golden, as New Mexico summers sometimes are, not brutal but merely very warm, and the land was in good shape, and the cattle were fat and the creek ran clear. And one evening in August, Andrew and Theodora sat on the front porch in their usual configuration, his arm around her, her shoulder against his, watching the light leave the sky in the particular extravagant way it left New Mexico skies, all orange and rose and violet. And Samuel was arriving the following week to begin his work in the territory, and Elias was in the barn finishing the evening chores with a seriousness that made his father proud, and Clara was inside at the table writing in the journal she had been keeping since she was 9, and the ranch was quiet and full and entirely itself. Theodora said, "Do you remember what you wrote to me?" "In the letter," he said. "I remember," she said. "You wrote that Samuel sat on the porch steps in the evenings and stared out at the road as if waiting for someone who was never going to come. He was quiet for a moment. I wrote that. He was waiting," she said. "He just did not know what for." Andrew looked at the road, the same evening light, the same porch steps where a small boy had once sat in the weight of 2 years of silence. He thought about the letter that had taken 4 drafts to get honest enough to send, and the reply written in a clear and direct hand that had taken 3 readings to fully absorb, and the stage arriving in October and a woman stepping down and looking at Cimarron as if she was ready to take its measure, and the porch step, and the dark eyes considering her, and the kitchen in November, and the one small word that had broken everything open, her name in a child's rusty voice. He said, "So were we, I think." Theodora was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, I think we were." The stars came out above the hills in the ancient and extravagant way they came out over New Mexico, one and then many and then all of them at once, and the night was warm and full of the sounds of the ranch at rest, horses breathing in the corral, and the distant call of a nighthawk, and the creek talking to itself in the dark. And Andrew Calloway held his wife on the porch of the house they had built together out of grief and patience and honesty, and something that had started as a careful, cautious, almost frightened feeling in his chest and become the entire foundation of the life he was living. He said quietly, "Theodora," she said, "Andrew." It was all that needed to be said. The stars held their enormous positions over the hills of New Mexico, and the ranch was quiet and alive, and the road that led from the gate to the world beyond it had brought exactly what was needed, at exactly the right time, and the porch steps held the weight of 2 people who had found each other in the particular way that people find each other when they are honest enough and brave enough and patient enough to let it happen, and everything was complete, and nothing of significance remained unresolved. And the night went on, warm and vast and generous around them,